Hello, friends, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Speaking of Equity, where every conversation is a conversation about equity. My name is Cornelius Godfrey, and I'm your host, and I'm pleased to be joined with Dr. David Recker. We're glad to have him both as a friend of the podcast and the principal of Hamilton Elementary. Welcome, Dr. Recker.
Thanks for having me, Cornelius.
Yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you're taking the time out of an otherwise busy day. It sounded like you were getting into the weeds or maybe into the hedges earlier.
Yes, yep. We needed a little bit of a landscaping facelift out here, so other duties as assigned.
So you heard it here first, folks. Our principals in Troy, no job too big, no job too small. And we're glad to have you because you are a respected voice in the district in this area. And I would imagine you wouldn't put yourself on any platform in terms of the work of equity, but your peers happen to really value your voice. And I appreciate you taking the time to share it with us today. And as we begin this conversation, I wonder, as we're sharing our thoughts on, equity and the work of equity in Troy, I would wonder, how you might share your own motivation to be, a champion or a leader in the world of equity, in addition to being an educational leader, and how have, experiences that you've had or learnings that you've participated in really fueled your fire to see this advance in the district, but more specifically in your building.
So I think growing up, Cornelius, I grew up in a very homogeneous area where everyone looked like me, had the same religious background that I did, a rural farming community in Northwest Ohio. And so I didn't think really critically about equity or about diversity, about race, socioeconomic status until I went off to college. And I went to the University of Dayton, the best school in the nation. And I was lucky enough to be a part of the Urban Teacher Academy at the University of Dayton. And both my internships in student teaching in urban public schools in Dayton, Ohio, as well as just the coursework and continued conversations around these topics, opened my eyes to something that I had been blind to and injustice that I had been blind to growing up because I was on the end receiving privilege as a result. And so I was lucky then to teach in a really innovative environment in an urban school called the Dayton Early College Academy for a few years after college. And that really continued my focus on these topics. But why it still matters to me is my ultimate goal when I look around at Hamilton Elementary School is that someone's indicators, whether demographic or zip code, would not be a predictor of their success here at Hamilton. And so I guess I'm just constantly reimagining or rethinking my own behavior, the systems we have as a school to how to get closer to that ideal future, which is a hard goal, but a worthy goal. And I see the faces and I see the humans connected to that goal, and it matters a lot to me then.
Oh my, well, thank you so much for sharing, how, that foundation of, an equity-minded approach to education was laid for you in that experience in, your early years as an educator. And I appreciate that those connection points and those relationships, and maybe even some resources that were made available at that time, really pushed and challenged your thinking. I wonder, would you share for our audience, what are some of those relationships, maybe, people that you've met or even leaders in the world of equity or education, and possibly resources that have really influenced your thinking going forward into, your position now as an educational leader?
I would say first and foremost, the mentorship and learning under Dr. Rashonda Neonani, the director of the Urban Teacher Academy at the University of Dayton. We still talk. I'm going to be seeing her next week in a panel and a learning session myself. She was the first who really just showed me an experience that I had not lived and that I felt deeply troubled by. As far as continued relationships, the work of Teachers College allows me to stay a learner in equity and on topics related to it. So I've had the privilege of hearing Dr. Sonia Sherry Paul, really all of the TC staff is passionate about equity. And so when we're learning about literacy, we are somehow doing it from the lens of equity, or when we're looking at books, we're thinking about mirrors and windows to our kids. It kind of is woven throughout rather than just another thing. I would say that there are a lot of colleagues in the district too who have pushed me to keep learning. So I can think of, Natalie Hazebrook, yourself, Shari Paulus, who Chris Griefer, encouraged me to read books that I haven't read that have challenged me, that aren't experiences I've had, and just kind of humble me, if you will, and make me remember that there's a lot to learn still. As I've told you before, I don't feel like an expert in this topic because it wasn't something I was extremely conscious of from a young age, but I'm very interested in learning more. So right now I have on my table from yourself, Courageous Conversations About Race Up Next. I was lucky to read Coaching for Equity with my staff. Really just getting our hands on whatever we can. I have a lot of great colleagues in the district who are constantly saying, I learned this idea through this text, and it's a good chance for me to try to have a window in.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing your position, not only as an educational leader, but a lead learner and a learning partner for so many in our district. I think it's important for our community, parents and students alike, to see that we never see ourselves as educationers having, finished our journey, but we're always moving forward and using really innovative ways and relationships and the latest research and the wealth of knowledge that is being produced, especially recently, to really inform our practice and be reflective about how we're going about doing the business of educating students and communities. And, as we think about this idea of the school as the center of the educational life of a community, I wonder how you've positioned yourself as someone who can, share knowledge, but also be a listener, particularly with our community members who are struggling to meet with the relevance of this work. So lots of our families are excited about seeing advancements in equity, but there are some who are still struggling to see why this is an important place for us to sit and reflect and really push for advancement. How have you positioned yourself as a listener, and what advice can you give some of our listeners now as they position themselves as those who can present equity as a worthwhile venture, not only in schools, but in the community as well?
So as far as a listener, I think being willing to listen to anyone, it may not be necessarily someone you work with every day in your school. It might be a parent in the pickup loop. It might be a new custodian who you're onboarding. It might be the person who you see at Kroger each Friday when you do your checkout. There's an experience to learn from everybody. And a goodness to see in everybody too. Here at Hamilton specifically, we are very lucky to have a really diverse student body that has a ton of first generation American students. And I get to listen and learn a lot, whether it's with parent volunteers at lunch or at the PTA meetings. I get to just learn a lot about additional backgrounds that I did not know about at a young age. So that's always been fun. And I try my best, as you said, I'm not an expert in this topic, but to sometimes share things that I'm learning about or I'm reading with my parent community. So Erin Detmer is a great thought partner of mine. And we are often hunting articles together. And when we find one that we love, we'll share it with our parent community in our weekly communications, or a topic that we ourselves are learning about, which I think is important because, again, you don't ever arrive at a place of complete knowing in this. And it's just important to keep learning.
Yeah, and I really appreciate, you sharing some of those touch points that you have that maybe might not occur to all of us who are possibly unfamiliar with what it means to be a building principal at the elementary level. For those of us who might not know and don't have a context for what that looks like, can you share what some of, your day-to-day challenges and how you've positioned yourself as a leader to meet those challenges with a lens of equity?
The day-to-day challenges. Wow. So this being my first year as an elementary school principal, the most glaring challenge has been safety and access to learning in times of COVID. Trying to think what other challenge we've had. Wonderful attendance. I thought that would be a challenge at starting the year, but kids have been able to access learning. I think a challenge we have, though, is our staff are predominantly white, middle-class staff members, myself included too. So we don't necessarily represent the continuum of diversity of the students here at Hamilton from a cultural or racial perspective. So I think in all honesty, we have to just remember that we have a lot to learn from our kids about what communication looks like, how respect is communicated, what it means to be a good student. Some of our parent groups have different lived experiences of how they should support the school or not support the school with their child's education too, coming from various countries. So I guess you could say those are challenges, but the word I'm hesitant to say challenge too, because there are so many strengths that our awesome, diverse community here brings, and we are always learning so much from each other and benefiting from each other that it's something we still need to accomplish and work on, but it's not like a massive obstacle, if you will. One thing I'm just thinking about too is how, again, that question of how to make sure that socioeconomic status, cultural indicators, demographics are not going to be predictors of our kids' success here at Hamilton. And so that means looking at everything with an open mind, whether it's the language we use with students, the resources we allocate to specific students, who gets intervention and how fast do they get the intervention, who has access to the best quality tier 1 instruction, who has first choice of, their elective in the morning and at what time of the day. I know those might seem like small, insignificant details when thought about in isolation, but when you look at them all as a whole, you can see how that they could contribute to someone's success in life. And we just want to make sure here that we are setting all kids up to be the awesome selves we know they could be.
That's amazing. That's amazing, Dr. Recker. And I appreciate how, you're identifying and naming, this idea that, for some of our families in contexts that are not thinking in these ways, that those indicators can be, pretty solid predictors of what their educational world looks like. So your ability to not only name that, but to counteract it with equitable practices that balance those scales really does a lot for our families. And, we appreciate you as an educational leader and the thinking that you provide for the district. And that's really the goal behind this Leader Series. And speaking of equity, our goal is to see how we might open the curtains so that others who are, either parents or community members can understand what the thinking is in the world of equity for our leaders who are at the helm of this very large ship called Troy School District. And we appreciate you sharing your thoughts. And we appreciate you being a listener and viewer. Speaking of equity, we know that these opportunities to hear from our leaders in our building, be they at the district or building level, really help to give context for the directions that we're moving in as a district. And we appreciate you sharing your time with us. Tune in the next episode of Speaking of Equity, and we'll see you then.